Ladies and gentlemen, it is Wednesday. We are here with Matthew Shapiro, JD,
Hello.
Tim Seavey from Bizolutions. I
Hey,
am
hey.
Jared Kubika Miller, a debate coach, professor. We are all from Proto Communications and DebateSensei. So this week we have a discussion that, um, at first it was just a basic sort of concept in debate, but considering the day's events, I think we got a lot of ways that we could apply it. So anyone that's watching this in the future, this is when the coronavirus is really dropping here in America, man. And it's really the World Health Organization just declared it as a pandemic, and there's a lot of news out there right now. So regardless, we're going to focus on our concept today. That concept is presumption, and it actually does have some applicability considering the current events of the day. Let me do a really quick rundown and then I'll have everyone else jump in, okay? Presumption is basically and this will just be my words, okay? And that'll be my first question. If you have a better way of explaining it, the way I explain it is what you believe before you actually have evidence. This is my what am I going to presume is true? But at the same time, I recognize that if any evidence comes to the contrary, I am willing to change my opinion, but I'm going to presume that something is true. This one thing is true until proven otherwise. Um, Matt, you got a law background. I think you might have something to say. Is presumption kind of along those lines?
That's a great way to explain it. As far as the law is concerned, I mean, I think it's also a great way to kind of illustrate the point. I don't know how familiar anyone out there is, but in law, there are two sides. Just like in debate, there's an adversarial process that occurs. We all know of like the courtroom scenario, but the the law or rule of presumption comes into play in where in a lawsuit, no matter if criminal or civil, there's either a prosecutor or a plaintiff, and they are asserting a cause of action or a charge against somebody. And essentially, a presumption means that in order for them to win, they have to prove their case. And that is exactly the same thing as in a debate round. The affirmative team has to prove some cause of action, they must prove to the judge something. And essentially what presumption means is the second the first affirmative or the prosecutor sits down, the neg or the defendant is technically allowed to look straight at the judge, and if they truly believe that what they just said, taken as true, does not equate to a cause of action, then you win. And in the most ridiculous sense of the word, you could just sit down as the neg basically and say, yeah, everything they just said doesn't mean they win, and you sit down. That in law, technically that can happen. In debate, that never happens because we're all here to debate. But it's
Well,
just
let's do that. Tim, has that ever happened to you? You ever win on presumption? You remember ever?
I've seen neg teams stand up and be like, burden of proof was not met, and then try and call it. But I don't think anyone has ever suicide sat on that argument. That would be ballsy as hell. But I don't think many teams are willing to do that.
I mean, I might.
I wouldn't recommend it.
I've seen coaches talk about how that if presumption's not met, then they're like, screw it, you lose. You know what I mean? That they don't listen to anything beyond that.
Well, I think there's maybe different standards, and this is also a question for Matt, maybe just for my own clarification. When you're talking criminal cases, and maybe I'm totally off base here, but we're talking criminal cases, that's where beyond a reasonable doubt, that language comes up, right? Like the bar, or if you were to use debate parlance, like the burden of proof, is you have to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that the defendant is guilty. Versus in civil cases, it's like a 50-50 thing, or like what's the difference there? I'm just interested for me because I feel like debate, you never really get down to that bright line of like how much proof is enough proof. So I wonder if law has a more useful, flushed out bright line.
it is high standard of proof. That's exactly what it is. It's kind of hard to explain. And honestly, I mean, I am not the most, vetted debate theorist in the world, but from what I understand, I mean, I can't really compare anything like that in debate. In debate, like, the standard is more just like whoever can. There's a very abstract standard of proof in debate. I mean, it's just kind of the point. Like, and to be perfectly honest, in law, it's abstract too. So it's not like, but I've never heard someone in the debate round say like they haven't met a higher standard. They've only met some low standard or something like that. Like it almost seems like a concession if you were to argue something like that.
So on topicality, that's kind of what the basis is. It's like they didn't prove the resolution true, so you vote against them because they didn't meet presumption. It is kind of like underpins some other concepts as well, right? But in law, one of the most common presumptions that you got is the presumption of innocence. Right? You're presumed innocent until proven guilty. And that is a model that debate uses in order to kind of have a framework from which to work. And so that's why the affirmative has the burden of proof, even though when you're talking about criminal cases versus like, should we raise the minimum wage? There's like, you kind of have to abstract that. Like, what's the presumption of innocence when you're talking about economic policies?
Well, again, like in my mind, like, so in debate, the affirmative team, from my understanding, they're the only person. This is me and Jared have talked about this several times, so I'm gonna just dive into a little analysis really quick about how debate is different than sports. Okay, in debate, this theory of presumption is one thing that is fundamentally different than a basketball game or a football game. Okay. In debate, what we're trying to say, what this whole conversation today is trying to illustrate to you is that, if the affirmative team gets up and says something and the neg says they did not score a point, or if the neg, more importantly, denies their shot, as we've talked about before, and sits down, then that means that the affirmative team loses. And this is kind of where a bunch of stuff, offense, defense, comes into play, because this is where in debate, you can just block a shot. You can just say their plan won't solve, and sit down, right? And some teams choose to run a counter plan and try to score their own points. In a neg team does not need to score a point to win a debate. But in sports, why it's different is because there is either a presumption for both teams or no team has the presumption. Both teams whoever scores the most points wins. And people think of debate in those terms because they're so used to sports. But just know that technically speaking, one of the easiest ways technically to win a debate is to just say they don't, block their shot and sit down. And that way you defend as little as you have to and you simply dismantle their case.
Well, I think this comes to an interesting point that we had previously when we were talking about solvency and offense versus defense. So this argument of vote on risk of solvency comes up a lot.
Right.
So there's this defensive strategy saying like it is unlikely that, so a neg team can come up and say it is unlikely that the plan will solve the problem, or we can even say it's extremely unlikely. It's 90% the case that it will fail. And the government team oftentimes will stand up and be like, sweet, we got 10%. There's no counter plan. Vote on risk of solvency. And like, because they have some small percent of possibly getting it, now they win it in. So that is where it seems, at least in my understanding, a little bit more like civil cases where it's like more likely than not, rather than beyond a shadow of a doubt.
See, that situation is where the affirmative is actually flipping presumption. Like they're using presumption to their advantage. Like at some point, they're like, if there's no counterplay, if there's no offense, then you presume that solvency wins. And so it is a really powerful, even though I rarely see people describe it in those terms. Presumption is a really powerful force in debate if people just kind of acknowledged it face on. It would be really powerful.
It's so important because, like any argument in debate, you have to say these arguments. Like, if you do not bring them up on the neg, you can't just silently go through an entire debate and then at the end, after not mentioning the word presumption and explaining the importance and how it ties to what they've said and what you've said, until you've done that work, you have not won the debate. Like that is mandatory. I mean, we've talked about how judges are not supposed to have any sort of what did you say, tabula rasa? They have no knowledge. So like, if you don't, they also have no knowledge of presumptions until you tell them. You know? Like so you need to. That is on you, and it's really something where if an affirmative team somehow does not, like Jared says, tries to flip their presumption, that's where the neg should stand up and say, there are rules of debate, and you must prove something. The only time, by the way, that changes or it can change is when you start running counter plans, and things of that nature, where like now you're trying to prove something also. Now you've opened yourself up to having the same attacks now on your plan, your counter plan. So that's where the strategy and neg strategy can come into play.
Well, maybe this is an unpopular opinion. Maybe Jared, you disagree with this, but I think that that's a good thing, because I think that forces the negative team. I think there is becoming something of a burden on the negative team to present a counter plan. I think that because more and more affirmative teams are making that argument of like, hey, no counterplan was presented, therefore try or die. Like that little phraseology there, I think because it's becoming so popular, it's forcing negative teams to have something that they pose. And I think that's a good thing. I think that more people trying to expend brain power to solve some particular problem is better. Now, granted, that puts the neg, you could say, maybe at a disadvantage, because they've got to deal with like procedurals and disadvantages and then also come up with their own solution. But I think that's a good thing. I think there's a pretty strong argument to be had when the affirmative side says like, hey, at least we're doing something. I, as a judge, am fairly likely to buy that, or at least to listen to that, because I think that it's pretty easy to be a critic, right? Like we're all critics all the time, but to like actually present some creative solution to a problem, even if it sucks.
I'm so ready to disagree with you right now, Tim. I'm not gonna lie to you. So like this is true. Like everything you said is true. I'm gonna say two situations where I would say one quick one is like if you are lost and you are barely having enough, time, or you're barely able to just kind of get some evidence that's to prove why they're wrong, then do not feel like you must do something else. And the second thing I'm gonna say is this, directly onto what you're saying, creative solutions are cool and they're nice, but like, we've talked about unrealistic. Like we don't need you to come and give us something. We don't want to waste our money, for instance, if it's a policy debate. We don't want to spend $5 million on something that won't solve. It's like that is a waste of money. And like it's important to say like, your risk of solvency argument is good. And I can see how like, when times get desperate, people will start reaching for things, which Jared, I think, is kind of a hearken to this time right now being one of these times where like I could just tell you drink some snake oil and you should invest $5 billion in snake oil and everything's going to be good because we have snake oil. What happens is we have a masking argument. You have all these things to say, not only are you not solving, you're wasting money that could have been spent doing something else, and we can argue all day. I understand what you're saying, Tim, and I don't disagree that like.
So I think the thing is that like in law versus politics, there is a difference between the way presumption works. And I think what's happening is that forensics coaches for so long have been borrowing from law that they don't look at this sort of rhetorical stuff that happens in Congress and in assemblies and stuff like that and how it's different. So Richard Whately was the dude who kind of like really wrote the book on presumption, and it really influenced law. And this was a while ago, right? There's the Archduke Richard Whately from a while ago, right? And so there's reasons why we assume or we presume innocence, not because we think that everyone in front of a court is innocent. That actually quite the opposite. It's much more likely that they're guilty if they gotten to that point, right? But the point is that we need to presume that they're innocent because it's so important that we don't incarcerate innocent people, that we want to have this sort of like conservative, like protecting the innocent from punishment, because otherwise that would be re-victimizing people. In policy, that analogy doesn't necessarily work, but people still try to like force it in there where the status quo is presumed to be innocent, and then you need to indict it in order to enforce a policy. And like I'm kind of going with like, Tim like has a point, but about how for debate forcing the negative to come up with some stuff is good, but then again, like if we apply it to the real world, you don't just go around saying, well, anything.
At least I've got a plan.
Yeah, anything works. You know what I mean? It's like I might as well do anything. It's like, and so the problem I have with presumption sometimes is how we apply it in debate in order to make the game more interesting, and how that affects our real life logical sort of rational conclusions that we come to. I'm wondering if sometimes like it's creating some damage, that the way that we approach presumption is good for the game, but not necessarily when you're done with the game.
So at like a higher level, Matt, I'll let you just real quick on it. But I think at a higher level, the reason why I like to see negative teams come up with a solution was kind of the point that I was getting at before, is that it's easier to be a critic than it is to be a creator. It's easier to like come up with a ton of reasons why something's bad. And I think debate is around to teach critical thinking. Like that's a really good thing. People should have a skeptical eye for policies and for ideas and think through scenarios of like where something may actually have negative implications. But I also think that it's a lot easier for debate land to just be critical. And there's like this kind of like swagger that comes with really successful debaters being super cynics, and like everything is a waste and no policy will ever solve and only chaos is the only thing, and like go like chain smoke some cigarettes and tell me why like nihilism is best. I get from a philosophy world like where that's cool, but I don't think that necessarily creates like solution oriented people. So I don't personally like where that goes. And I think so, Matt, maybe this is circling it back in where the negative side, kind of to Jared's point, if they are not proposing a plan, they're defending the status quo. And oftentimes the very like top of a debate case is this like apocalyptic layout of why the status quo is so bad. So it's hard for the negative team to be like, yup, that whole harm scenario is totally fine, and we're not going to do anything different. We're not going to do this plan because that bad scenario is better than the plan. So I think having to defend the status quo is usually where the negative team gets backed against a wall and has to have a counter plan.
There's two real different, forms of debate in my mind. Well, there's a million different debates, but I mean, some of the forms you stay with all year long. I'm kind of talking to you when I talk about this. When you have the opportunity to get to know teams throughout a semester or a year, and you know what they run, first off, also like this is kind of where you get to be yourself in debate, right? If you hear someone's plan, say in the first term in the year, and you agree like that has some solvency, but you find some other way that will solve better, then if your own instincts tell you to do that because of the substance of what you've learned through your research, then go solve some other way because they're running a great plan. But on the flip side of that, like when you hit a team the same time over and over and over, and you've philosophically maybe do believe that like their plan does not work, then you really have an opportunity to like research and prepare for that team's plan who may be used by other plans, and like you'll just know if you hear that you have this great defense to when this comes up. And like I've just felt it, I've done LD where you hit the same thing over and over and over, and like it gives you that opportunity to like develop your research skills and make every debate a little bit different. And like you don't have to just run some argument every single round you're on the neg, and every single round you're on the AF. It kind of expands your horizons if you're willing to take the time to do it, to like know that when I hear someone run X plan or some sort of specific thing, I am ready with serious research as to show plainly why that is a waste of time. And if you want to call a counterplan me saying we don't waste our money and we spend it more properly somewhere else, I don't think that constitutes as a counterplan. I think that's just an inference in saying your plan doesn't work and that's what we should do.
Right. So there's one other distinction in presumption I definitely wanted to get to, and that's between artificial and natural presumption. That's a big sort of like facet to this. Anyone who's starting off like trying to grapple with this concept of presumption, I really think understanding the difference between artificial and natural is really important. So the best way to understand it is like case in point. So the case in point for artificial presumption is in law, the presumption of innocence. Like before when I was talking about, we don't presume that people are innocent because the statistics bear out that most people are innocent when they come to court. It's because of a reason that we want to, like not punish people. So we impose the presumption of innocence on purpose. That would be artificial presumption, right? Natural presumption is just kind of like where you happen to fall generally, right?
Logical inference almost.
Yeah, that's a lot messier. And so circling back around to the coronavirus issue that we're dealing with right now, like for instance, one example of natural presumption is the natural tendency for people to distrust the media. And we're seeing how that's bearing out like really negative consequences. People are thinking it's like, oh, I don't believe what the media is saying, so I'm not going to think that this is a real threat. And they go about and they start infecting other people. And that's like how like natural presumption against the media, because people hate the media so much, whatever you want to call the media, that sort of natural presumption against it means that they assume that the opposite is true about what the media is saying. The media is saying that this is a really bad pandemic. They're like, it's way over. It must be overblown because the media is saying it. That's an example of presumption, like having real world effects right now. Like I think like any conspiracy theory, people just presume that whatever the government says, the opposite must be true. People presume that whatever the liberal or conservative media outlet says, the opposite must be true. And that presumption is something that, I don't know, as an instructor, I want people to go beyond that. You know what I mean? Like just their gut instinct, and they think that that's going all right. I don't know. What do you think about conspiracy theories and presumption as I laid it out, as far as like natural presumption goes?
I think that it affects every, we're being, honestly, I still think we're being almost very specific in saying like it only applies to conspiracy theories. I mean, any opinion you have is based on some presumption that you have. I mean, and naturally, just in my mind, I think X, Y, and Z. Like, any bias, any stereotype, anything you have is based on this sort of idea of a natural presumption. But yeah, as in a case of conspiracy theory, it's a great idea where like if your uncle Gary is always saying X, Y, and Z, then hey, that's that. And like you just know when he's watching the news channel he hates that it's just not the one. He doesn't believe a word on it, like no matter what they say, and it's just because they said it.
But I think that was what Tim was talking about earlier too, about just being a cynic.
By the way, I love my Uncle Gary. Shout out to my Uncle Gary.
That dude knows fake news when he smells it.
And he doesn't. He's not like that.
But Tim, what you were talking about before about like just being a cynic, like if we applied that outside of the debate round, I would think that people who have sort of wild conspiracy theories, I don't know, like the Flat Earth Society, they just presume that everything NASA comes out with, the opposite must be true, right? And that's an example of just they've imposed this presumption on themselves about one particular source of information, and all of a sudden now it's always wrong, it's always incorrect. Cynic.
Criteria is a form almost of a presumption. Like you're kind of being like, we are going to presume that whatever does this is best. That's almost kind of like framing. It's not a presumption in the truest sense. It's artificial. You're kind of creating it. You're setting it, and you can argue with it though. On either side. But these are the types of things where like once someone concedes that, then then maybe that's the presumption in this round, or maybe you agree. So.
What do you think, Tim? Like, I thought your comment earlier about cynicism kind of like works its way into more of a real world application.
I recognize now that that's my own presumption. Like, right? So, like, I presume that debaters have this state bad predisposition, and most cases flow from that. And I think like it maybe goes and flows. It seems to me though that most cases that win, or a lot of cases that win at like really high levels, tend to operate outside of the state, right? Like, and I come to like those. When I'm saying the state, like they're not the USFG passing a policy or California legislature passing a policy. It's like micropolitics, or it's like we are going to have a rhetorical discussion around this, or we're going to have a sit-in or like stage a protest or something. And I think those things are really cool and interesting debates come from them. All that said, though, I think that debaters are smart people. So there's some of my own presumption. And I like when smart people apply their brains to create it, like to interesting problems, because I like hearing sometimes plans come out that are really friggin' cool. So I've seen, for example, some team, it was a middle school team, they were arguing on a topic that was just like, we should change the educational system. And they had an argument for why we should not be teaching advanced algebra. We should be teaching statistics. And like all these reasons where like voters are swayed by bad statistics all the time, and consumers are misled by like, misinterpreted statistics, because very few people take stats in school unless like you happen to go that route or you went into some like grad program. Most people just go through the regular algebra route and that's it. And algebra is not as applicable in many real life forms as compared to statistics. And I thought that was fascinating. Like, so sometimes these really smart kids, really smart competitors, given a challenging problem, will come up with cool solutions. So I am of the position, I think that always like more solutions is better. So to that end, I guess I have a little bit more, I guess I have a little bit higher bar for negative teams when those rounds come up, like when there's ground for a counterplan. So I think, Matt, you were saying something really interesting, though, because we do a lot of discussion of policy rounds. When you're talking about a value round, I think that's really cool. Like, the presumption is this is the highest value thing, right? So we're going to say that individual liberties, that is the highest value thing, and whichever side can justify or can create the greatest individual liberty, or the greatest amount of happiness for the greatest number of people, or whatever. I think that that's a cool lens through which to analyze rounds. Do you guys see a lot of rounds where the value rounds where the value is contested, of people coming up with a counter value? Do you see that a lot?
Not a lot. It has happened before, but usually, even when values are contested in a debate, it's meaningless. Like I can't even recall a time where there's a meaningful contest over values. Like whoever won that contest actually had that ripple effect. Now, usually, it's like the value debate is here, and all the other arguments are here, and they don't meet ever, right? And so. And it's harder than it seems. So I don't blame debaters for doing that. It's hard to kind of connect those things. I think that's higher level logic.
At the highest level, that honestly I never really truly got to do, which, Jared, you used to always tell me about it. You got books on it. We've talked about it. One thing that comes to mind all of a sudden with artificial presumptions and being able to kind of like, Tim, you're talking about like create, argue, like I think that should be this. Irony. Okay. Like irony is a thing in debate, for all of you who don't know, where you can kind of, debate is a game. Debate is not, it does not have to be true. I mean, you could argue anything as long as you can convince the judge that like you've won. Right. And so in irony cases, you can essentially set the classic one that I remember, I've never actually ran it in a debate round, is to be like de-development, be like, oh, like the humans are harming the earth, so we should just like get rid of all the humans, and that way the earth will be great. like if you, it's a joke, it's humor, first of all, which is something that I love, and like I would always love to incorporate in debate, but it's hard, it's very difficult, it's risky, but if you were able to simply stand up and literally deliver an entire speech and member opposition to showing why you're right, using humor and irony, it's something that I've always wanted to do, and I hope someday, flourishes again in debate. I love it as an art form for words, and it's a game that we're playing. We get so caught up in being like just so smart, but sometimes it's all about having fun, and like hopefully we all get at that high level and can run irony cases.
All right, listen, we are closing in on a 30-minute mark here, so I have an idea. Anybody who's watching right now or in the future, anything that you would like to see us talk about debate, please post it in the comments, okay? As always, make sure that you hit the subscribe button, give us a few likes, share our videos with people. We're really trying to do this as sort of a service for the entire community. Not only that, but we're going to have, probably before next week, we're going to have a discussion about best practices when it comes to video and debate. This is in direct response to a number of national tournaments that have canceled because of the coronavirus. And we want to make sure that people are still able to participate in this activity that they love and also create the best quality stuff that we know that you're capable of. Okay. All right. Hey, thank you everyone for joining us this time. Remember, it's Matt Shapiro, JD, Tim Seavey from Visolutions. I am Jared Kubika-Miller, your professor in debate. We are all from DebateSensei. Thank you very much. Let us know what you like and what you want us to talk about. Okay. We'll see you next week.